The chaos continues on America's southern border, and the state of Texas thinks that they have a solution, at least in part. The state of Texas has now taken over, apparently, a portion of the border. It's a small portion, admittedly, just a little over 40 acres. But it's a park that the state has some control over. They've put the Texas National Guard there, and they've blocked the Border Patrol from entering the area. Remember, the Border Patrol has been cutting through the concertina wire that Texas has been assembling at the behest of the Department of Homeland Security. The Border Patrol not able to do that right now in Texas. In fact, the Border Patrol Union has actually issued a statement of support for what Texas is doing to enhance control of the southern border. For more on this, I want to bring in an expert on this subject. Mark Morgan is the former acting commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection under the Trump administration and now a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mark, good to have you with us, sir.
You too, Vince. Thanks for having me.
It is wild to see. You have the state of Texas is now blocked off a section of the border and said, we've got this area, you go elsewhere.
Yeah, Vince, I think it's important to put some context here. Well, why are we here? Why is the state of Texas having to do this to begin with? That's an important question. And the answer is pretty straightforward. Since day one, this administration took the most secure border in our lifetime, and they intentionally unsecured it. They have abdicated their constitutional responsibility under Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution to protect and defend all states from threats outside its borders. Any individual with a remote bit of intellectually honesty knows and sees the chaos and lawlessness at our border. Governor Abbott is trying to fill that void left by this administration's refusal to do their constitutional responsibility. And look, this is another step under Operation Lone Star, under the strategy of Texas, Governor Abbott, that the federal government should be doing. And it's pretty straightforward, kind of a part of a law enforcement strategy. And what they're doing right now, it's part of disruption and deterrence. They're trying to disrupt the ability of the cartels to push illegal aliens, drugs, criminals, national security threats across, and they're trying to deter illegal aliens from working with the cartels to come here illegally. It's pretty straightforward. It's exactly what we were doing under the Trump administration.
But they wouldn't have to do this were it not for the fact that the Department of Homeland Security is requiring Border Patrol agents to cut open Texas property, which is this concertina wire they're laying down in these buoy systems that they've been trying to lay down to stop the flow of illegal humanity into the United States. The Biden administration has been destroying these border barriers. It makes sense that Texas would react this way.
Vince, I could have said it better myself, but from day one. So the Biden administration stopped building the wall. Texas started building the wall. They tried to sue them to stop it. As you mentioned, the water barriers to put in. By the way, when I was commissioner, we were about ready to deploy those exact water buoys in the water, just as the Governor Abbott has done. They tried to do that. They sued them to stop it. The concertina wire, they put that up. They cut it. They lifted it. They're suing. Not only has the Biden administration dismantled every effective tool, authority, and policy we have to secure the border, they're actively trying to sue and prevent Texas from doing it. I mean, Vince, we're literally living in an alternate world right now.
We definitely are. It must create some interesting drama, though, down there in Eagle Pass, where you have state officials telling Texas National Guards, telling federal law enforcement officials, you are not to pass. You do not have jurisdiction here. You don't have access here. This is a standoff that's going to clearly escalate.
It has the potential, Vince, and that's another good point that some folks aren't talking about, because there is, look, you start getting a little bit in the technical law aspect, but there is a supremacy clause, right? The federal law trumps state law. And so I'm hoping, my sources are telling me, though, that Texas DPS, as they always do, they coordinated with Border Patrol in advance. They told them what was going to happen. They gave them time to kind of remove some of this stuff that they'd set up in the park.
Yeah.
So I think operationally, locally, I think leadership is going to work that out. I don't think this is a hill for Border Patrol to proverbially die on with respect to this. So I think you're going to see things worked out, but it could come to a head. I mean, the question is, what if Border Patrol leadership says, no, we're coming into that park? What happens then?
Right. But the United States has failed in its obligations to the state of Texas and all of these other border states, for that matter, every one of our states in the country. They have a constitutional obligation to protect states like Texas against invasion. They have failed by any definition of the term. I'm not sure what the number would need to be to call this an invasion. But from where I'm sitting, we are being invaded. We have millions of illegal foreign nationals from every country on the planet coming in at the invitation of the Biden administration. How is it not an invasion?
It is, Vince, and again, well said. And that's why, I started off with this is clearly they have abdicated that constitutional responsibility under Article 4, Section 4. And then the Constitution, it provides a remedy for that. In fact, I believe most of the states wouldn't even ratify the Constitution if Article 1, Section 10 hadn't been included. And part of that is if the federal government is unable to fulfill their constitutional duty to protect the states from invasion, the states have a self-help remedy. They get to step up and defend themselves. That's exactly what Governor Abbott is doing. And I'll go a step further with invasion. And this is very important. It's an invasion, not just of physical people. It's that. Plus, it's an invasion of drugs, of criminals, and national security threats. And who's driving that? The Mexican cartels. That's our enemy. So I think that as these lawsuits go, I'm hoping that it's going to get to the Supreme Court, and that issue of invasion under the constitutional issues is going to be at the forefront.
Yeah, and look, anyone who studies this, I know you know this obviously in more detail than most, it realizes that the beneficiary of the Biden administration, there is no greater beneficiary of the Biden administration's decision here than the cartels. And normally, if, say, we were conducting an operation within Mexico, we were trying to figure out a way to navigate in there, we'd have to assess first and foremost whether the law enforcement was compromised in the area, whether they were corrupted by the criminal enterprises around them. That's a really important element of this. Unfortunately, as good as the men and women of the Border Patrol are, their mission is compromised by the Biden administration's deference to the cartels rather than the American people.
Vince, absolutely correct. And that's a very important issue, is that this administration, being led by Secretary Mayorkas, again, I refer to Secretary Mayorkas, chief architect of the open border policy. At the stroke of his pen, he has literally transformed the Border Patrol mission. He has fundamentally shifted their mission from a law enforcement national security mission to that of being a processing enterprise. He has literally turned the Border Patrol into a federal travel agency. They've been pulled off the front line. They've been pulled away from their law enforcement and national security mission, relegated to the administrative duties associated with catch and releasing illegal aliens. And that's why I always say that's why the numbers are so important, because illegal immigration is not a victimless crime. It pulls those law enforcement and national security resources off the front line. Our border is unpatrolled and unmanned. We literally handed operational control over the cartels. And what do? Drugs, criminals, national security threats pouring across our border every day.
And then he has the temerity to say to the Border Patrol this past week, yeah, we're releasing more than 85% of the illegals who come into the country. 85%. So just imagine if if a police chief met with the cops and said, yeah, 85% of the criminals you're arresting, we're just releasing back into the community. I mean, it would be a nightmare. It would be a total nightmare. Who would want to do that job? I'm stunned that we have Border Patrol agents who are still hanging in there.
I agree with you. And think about it. That's another thing that this administration, the open border advocates, and look, I'm just going to be straight. Most of Democrats, they try to twist the narrative and a lot of American people, and they make it seem like what you just said isn't the case. Everybody listening needs to understand, if you enter in between the ports of entry, that's a crime. It doesn't matter what you claim afterwards, right? It doesn't matter if you file asylum claim, which, by the way, we know 90% of are fraudulent because they're economic migrants. The end doesn't justify the means. The physical act of entering in between the ports of entry is a crime. And we are not only are there zero consequences for committing this crime, but as you said, we're actually rewarding them. We're giving them everything that they want. We're releasing them into the interior of the United States. We're allowing them to be free from deportation. We're allowing them to work illegally. We're letting them send money home and bring family members. And then they feign, well, guys, we don't understand what's causing this invasion level of illegal immigrants.
There's let's move to Congress now. I know there's some debate going on at the moment about what, if anything, they're going to do to rectify the problems at the border. Democrats clearly just want to accelerate more foreign nationals in, and some Republicans would like to actually see the border fixed. What do you make of the ongoing border negotiations in Congress?
Look, I'm not. I'm skeptical right now with what I'm hearing. Unfortunately, what they're doing on the Senate side, they're doing it behind closed doors. Vince. There's not a lot of transparency with respect to what they're doing. So that's inviting a lot of skepticism. And of course, like everything, things are leaking out. Here's what we know is that H.R. 2, the strongest piece of border security legislation that's ever been passed by the House, all but one senator on the Republican side voted for it, including Senator Lankford. H.R. 2 provides the pathway to actually reverse course and instill meaningful policy that will be able to allow us to secure, defend, and protect our borders. So that's the answer. But what we're hearing right now is on the Republican side, again, led by Senator Lankford, they're proactively working to water down what they just all voted on is the answer. In fact, Senator Lankford, what we're hearing right now is he's actually negotiating with Secretary Mayorkas. And why is that important, Vince? Because this week, as you know, the House under Chairman Mark Green began impeachment proceedings against Secretary Mayorkas, which I fully support. Meanwhile, Senator Lankford is actually asking Secretary Mayorkas advice on how to fix the crisis while the House is impeaching him. I mean, that's literally like asking the arsonist to help you with the strategy to put out the fire. It doesn't make any sense.
Oh man, you took the analogy right out of my mouth. That's exactly right. I was thinking that's insane to me because Mayorkas is the one. I mean, there are a million reasons why he deserves to be impeached, but one of them, one of the big ones, is he came out outright and said that illegally immigrating to the country is not a basis for being deported. Well, you're violating the law. It's crystal clear what the law is. That is the basis for being deported, illegally immigrating into the country. And Mayorkas said no.
Right. You're right. We can keep going on. I'll just mention a couple of more, right? Just real quick. So not only did he say that, but he also is releasing people in the United States in violation of the law. He's actually utilizing parole unlawfully, and he has the past 36 months. There's been over 1.8 million known gotaways, yet he, under oath, has told Congress and the American people that our borders are secure. I mean, every aspect, he's abdicated every ounce of his oath, his abuse of his authority, and he's overseen the worst border security disaster in our lifetime that's unleashed a tidal wave of criminals, drugs, and national security threats pouring in our country every single day.
It is interesting. It is interesting, though. I'm looking at some Democrats that, to the extent that they can, raise a defense, they're like, well, don't attack Mayorkas. Mayorkas is just executing the policies of the Biden administration. You can't impeach a man for following the policies of the president, which makes me say, okay, fine, impeach Biden for it then. If that's the claim you want to make, then Biden deserves to be impeached for that alone.
If that's the litmus test, then I agree with you 100%. But here's the issue, because look, I was Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection, the largest law enforcement organization in the United States. You have, at every level of that, you have your own fiduciary responsibilities. And if I believe that the administration, like when I served President Trump, if I believed any order that he was giving me was unlawful, was against the laws enacted by Congress, I had actual responsibility to refuse to support that, right? Number one. So like you said, and look, Secretary Mayorkas, he's done things literally at the stroke of his pen. He's enacted policies, like you said, that he has directed the men and women under his care to not enforce the law. He has told ICE, I don't care, even if you run across somebody that's in the country illegally, if they don't fall within the parameters that Secretary Mayorkas enacted, that whether they've been convicted of a violent felony or they're known suspected terrorists, ICE is nope, let them stay.
Yeah.
That came at the end of Secretary Mayorkas' pen, as well as lying to Congress.
Well,
there's plenty there that he did.
There's a lot there. And you've reminded me of one last thing that I'd like to hit with you, which is, these Democrat mayors across the country who are complaining about the overwhelmed status of their cities. There's so many migrants, they say, here in our city. We need more federal resources. If they really cared about this, they would stop being sanctuary cities, and they would tell ICE when they had illegal immigrants in custody. They are not doing that, are they, Mark Morgan?
Boom. Vince, this is why I love coming on with you. I couldn't have said it better myself. And let's keep in mind, There's some good and some bad here, right? So finally, look, I'm glad that the Democrat mayors are standing up, and because what's happening is they're finally admitting with respect to and acknowledging the chaos and lawlessness at our borders, right? So that's a good thing, and it's keeping the discussion. That's why you see polls where Biden is upside down by 70% with respect to what he's doing at the border. But here's where it all falls apart, as you're enumerating, is it's the solution. They're not actually asking for the Biden administration to reverse course on its open border policies, to actually get law enforcement back on the front line, to take our border away from the cartels. They're just asking for more U.S. taxpayer money to manage the crisis and threats after they're already in the country.
Mark Morgan, as always, really appreciate our conversations and all of your wisdom on this subject. Thank you, sir. Good to talk to you today. Have a great weekend.
You too. Thanks, Ben.
Well, Joe Biden traveled to Pennsylvania today. Once again in Pennsylvania, 2 weeks in a row. This time he's in the Lehigh Valley area visiting Allentown and Emmaus and some of the small businesses in the area. The campaign is emphasizing that the reason he's there is to meet with the Hispanic population in the area. This makes sense in a lot of ways for Biden's campaign because Biden had the lead he had in Pennsylvania in 2020 was 80,000 votes there by the final tally. Remember, he got a tremendous amount of support from Democrat precincts, which ran their elections in the most corrupt possible ways, whereas Republican-led precincts did not actually do a lot of the ballot curing and the late ballot submission shenanigans that we saw take place in many of those Democrat districts. And, of course, the state Supreme Court, run by Democrats, favored all of the Democrat shenanigans there. But Biden wins by 80,000 votes in the final assessment. But one of the areas that he really suffered demographically was among Hispanic voters who had headed towards Trump in a pretty dramatic way in Pennsylvania. Not enough to get him over the finish line, not enough to overtake, again, all of the nonsense that Democrats had undertaken in Pennsylvania's elections. So this makes a lot of sense for Biden to be there today. Now, that said, Biden has really not been seen in public for the last few days. Yesterday, Peter Doocy at the White House was asking Karine Jean-Pierre about this, and she said, oh, well, the 3 days prior, he was very busy. Yeah, I know, but he's had a bunch of time to sleep. Where is he? Where is he? How come we haven't seen him in 3 days? Last night, he initiated combat strikes without even, actually doing any sort of public appearance to justify why we're getting deeper into a war over in Yemen. And today, he pops up, takes the short stairs on Air Force One, both up and down, in order to go to the Lehigh Valley area of Pennsylvania. Before he got across the South Lawn, though, and onto Marine One, he dropped a tissue on the South Lawn. He was meandering across the South Lawn as he does, very slow and stiff. He's got that gait. And he's walking to the helicopter. And as he's doing it, reporters are yelling out to him, and he drops a tissue. You can kind of hear their reaction here as it just falls out of his hand, like he lost the feeling in his fingers.
The hostages in Gaza, are they any closer to being released?
Yeah, you heard at the end there, somebody said, oh, the president littered, they said, because Biden, it is weird, as he's walking, a tissue just falls from his hand onto the grass. Of course, some facilities worker having to pick up after the president after he litters right there on the South Lawn, probably not even aware that he was dropping trash as he walked towards Marine One. Any other presidential updates today? We'll share them with you right here on WMAL. Welcome back to the Vince Colonnese Show. One of the things we try to do here is dig into the dark money and influential forces behind pushing some of the worst ideas in the country. They deserve some sunlight. My next guest is very good at giving them some of that sunlight. He's an investigative reporter for the Washington Examiner. It's Gabe Kaminsky on the phone. Gabe, great to have you with us, sir.
Glad to be here.
You've got a piece this week in the Washington Examiner about how Joe Biden's green agenda is being formed and who exactly is pushing it. What have you discovered?
So there's an organization called Ceres, C-E-R-E-S, and I think your listeners, it'd be really, when you get a chance after you listen to this episode, look up this organization on the internet and just poke around their website. What we detailed in our story is how Ceres, this environmental charity based in Boston, is playing a really significant role shaping President Joe Biden's agenda, all while they're facing scrutiny from the GOP-led House Judiciary Committee led by Congressman Jim Jordan from Ohio that is basically subpoenaed this organization and is concerned that they could have violated antitrust law in kind of coordinating with corporations to take aim at the fossil fuels industry. But what our story details is really the main thing I'd point to is that Ceres is really behind a new SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission proposal that aims to require major companies, publicly traded corporations, companies, to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions. And this is kind of a grab in the eyes of free market groups and pro-fossil fuels groups to essentially lay the groundwork for a widespread crackdown on oil and gas appliances to force Americans to have to not be able to use the products that they so enjoy in our free market.
So they are facilitating the destruction of cheap, affordable, prolific American energy. That will drastically increase costs for consumers, won't it?
And I think what our story details to give you a picture of how Ceres is really notable and how this is a major charity shaping the federal government is that SEC records list that there have been at least 20 meetings in connection to this rule, this SEC proposal between Ceres personnel and the federal government. I'd note Ceres President Mindy Lover is a Democratic donor who was given cash to Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who in turn has been supporting this proposal. But also we obtained internal emails that show that essentially Ceres was in constant communication with the SEC on this rule. And even at one point, a staffer for Ceres emailed a sort of a climate lawyer who's influential in the climate movement to sort of key him in on how he was, quote, trying to help, end quote, an top SEC official on this rule, end quote, was very focused on the SEC climate disclosure rule. And this is something we see very, very often with the climate movement. It's something other really good climate reporters like Thomas Catenacci at Fox or someone who was at the Daily Caller a bit ago, Jack McElroy, reported on, but how there is this close tie between the federal government and activist groups, especially in this movement, and it often leads to conflicts of interest.
And we see a lot of money being thrown around. In your report today, there's a number that leaps off the page at me. It's $46 trillion. Let me just quote the sentence that you wrote. Ceres, you wrote, which was founded in 1989, notably manages a network with more than 220 institutional investors, claiming to handle more than $46 trillion in assets to, quote, accelerate the transition to a just, sustainable, net zero emissions economy, according to tax filings. In other words, you're looking at some of the biggest companies on the planet essentially colluding to destroy prolific energy for the United States and for the world.
Yeah, it's that number is staggering. When I filed this story, my editor saw the number, said, "Did you need to say billion?" I said, "No, it's literally trillion."
It's unbelievable.
And the significant thing is, look, this charity, the reason Jim Jordan and Republicans are scrutinizing it is because they are skeptical of the fact that it works hand in glove with private corporations to take aim at the fossil fuels industry. And on Ceres' website, on their archived website, they literally overtly say what that investor network does. They say, quote, it exists to, quote, pressure stock exchanges and capital market regulators to improve climate and sustainability risk disclosure. Well, that last part, risk disclosure, appears to be quite similar to this now SEC rule.
Okay, so what's next for Congress? Is it just Jim Jordan asks a bunch of questions and never gets any clear answers?
Yeah, so the House Judiciary Committee is specifically looking at Ceres' relationship, this antitrust angle. It's not necessarily this SEC angle that our story detailed. And Jordan, the Judiciary Committee is seeking information on Ceres' relationship with a climate coalition that includes major corporations. It's legal concern. But this SEC angle is actually more in the jurisdiction of the House Financial Services Committee. And my understanding is there are plans in the Financial Services Committee to probe a little bit of what we detailed, and also this SEC apparent conflict of interest angle between examples of sort of, there was prior reporting in Fox News on how, just that kind of supplements our story, on how Kristen Wyatt, who is a former SEC senior counsel, went to then go work for Persephone, which actually commissioned a study alongside Ceres, this climate group that was funneled essentially to the SEC to bolster its group, something called a cost-benefit analysis, which happens for rules. But all that to say, I think the House Financial Services Committee is an entity looking into this, and the House Oversight Committee in different respects is looking at energy and kind of foreign influence.
Well, gosh, I hope they do, and I hope they can give us some answers, because, you know, what this usually, the motivating factor is typically not some sort of like, oh, I'm going to actually save the planet. What it usually is there's a financial reason for this, that, you know, they're advancing, for instance, a higher threshold to join their industry. They're trying to muscle out small players who can't afford the regulatory costs of being in these industries. And so it's about kind of incumbency protection, typically, sold to us under the guise of doing something good for the planet.
Yeah, and the other thing that's important that we found through reviewing certain polling on this issue is that, really interesting statistic to me, we found that only 7% of American investors, American like asset managers, support actually this SEC disclosure policy, whereas 81% of foreign asset managers support this climate disclosure policy. I find it pretty interesting that American people involved with the financial industry aren't too keen on the government forcing them to report information about them, just like they wouldn't want to report information about their finances, because obviously speech is money, and on the contrary, there are foreign influence groups that apparently are pretty like the idea of American groups having to report information about the energy that they are emitting.
I know, it's wild. All right, so Gabe, speaking of speech, let me move to another issue that you're reporting on this week. You've been digging in for a while on the Biden administration's active censorship of the American people by way of outside proxy groups that it's worked with to do that. What is the latest on the State Department and the way that censorship has been carried out, and what is the Biden administration telling Congress?
Yeah, and from what this stems from is how the State Department granted $100,000 to a group called the Global Disinformation Index, which has been sort of covertly censoring outlets like the Washington Examiner, the Daily Caller, Newsmax, and others. And, you know, since that story time, we've seen sort of congressional pressure on the State Department, and the State Department seeking to clarify things about its grant, and Republicans growing dissatisfied with that. And we haven't seen, per se, Congress seemingly take this, accomplish much almost through its investigation so far, although we have seen the NDAA pass, which banned the Pentagon from funding GDI. So I guess that perhaps that is actually a major accomplishment. But the recent thing that we covered is that the House Small Business Committee, which has been investigating the State Department over its grants to groups that Republicans say are censoring conservatives, they've been sending a flurry of letters, and they recently got grant records from the State Department. But in the mind of the House Small Business Committee, these records are incomplete and do not encompass nearly at all the full scope of what they asked for. In their mind, the State Department is not acting in full compliance and providing information. And this comes really amid two major things: that NDAA, which passed, which banned Pentagon funding to groups that Republicans say are censorious, and B, a lawsuit filed by the Daily Wire and the Federalist against the State Department over its grant to the organization we reported on is blacklisting conservatives. And so according to people close to the House Small Business Committee, could be in the next month or so nearing subpoena territory to the State Department to compel further disclosure of records. And that obviously comes as discovery in that Daily Wire Federalist case could open up a lot of sort of a box of a lot of records that could give us details about how the government ever got to this place of working with groups like this.
So if I could summarize it, what you have is Congress asks the Biden administration for information on its censorship activities, and the Biden administration censors its own responses to Congress.
That seems to be the case. And I think I had said originally that Congress didn't accomplish anything. I don't think that. I think it's, I think they're in a tough position. I'm not saying I think that's, but I think they're working to try and obtain certain records, but it's obviously they're fighting with an administration that doesn't view, they don't accept the same premises. Republicans believe that the State Department funded groups that censored conservatives, and the Biden administration thinks that those groups that receive that money are sort of, fighting disinformation and falsehoods online and engaging in accurate fact checking, which, as we've long reported, is really not the case. It's partisan organizations that want to deplatform those they disagree with.
But by the way, it is still your constitutional right to say something that's untrue. You are allowed to do that, and you are allowed to, and the government can't stop you from doing that. And yet, the Biden administration is declaring that it is a social good to censor the American people.
Right, and the thing I'd point to is the other reason this development is notable is the Supreme Court will soon hear formerly Missouri Biden, now called Murthy v. Biden, related to Vivek Murthy, the head of HHS.
Yeah.
And that court case essentially is going to determine the level of communication that can occur between the federal government and private social media companies about sort of flagging content and the removal of content, because the federal government has come under fire due to this case, Missouri v. Biden, for urging social media companies like Facebook and Twitter, now X, to remove certain information in 2020 about the election or COVID-19 or topics that sort of Democrats didn't want on the internet.
Yeah, they can't outsource their tyranny to some outside organization. If they hired a group of private security to lock you in your home, the federal government would be impinging on your rights. Obviously, if they stop you from speaking, it's the same deal, honestly. All right, Gabe Kaminsky over at the Washington Examiner, thank you for all of your excellent work and your constant digging. Really appreciate your time today, sir.
Thanks.
All right, Gabe. Thank you, sir.